production.
Let's hope we are worthy of it.
Oh, the hell with it. Just get it done.
That's the spirit.
Got 5 seconds. 5.
What was your reception in Egypt like?
Well, when I arrived at the airport, I was really somewhat disappointed because I had been told before that could expect a very warm reception. As we got to the top of the ramp and looked down, it reminded me of Peking and Moscow. No people there, just the VIPs, a very good honor guard, the usual red carpet, Sadat standing down below to welcome us. He was very friendly and courteous and so forth. And as we got into a big open car, I rather wondered why he had insisted on that, because our Secret Service didn't want to have an open car because of security reasons, but he wanted an open car because there were no people. So we got in the car and we began to move out of the airport onto the main highway. And as we moved onto the highway, it was like hitting a tidal wave. There was just a sea of humanity surged around us. People by the thousands shouting, and they were saying, "Long live Nixon, long live Sadat, we trust Nixon, Egyptian-American friendship." Over and over again the shouts came. And the crowd was, by all accounts, one of the biggest certainly that I had ever seen, and certainly one of the most enthusiastic. The only one approaching it in enthusiasm was the one in Warsaw in 1959. Emotional, enthusiastic, and friendly.
How much does a crowd mean, though? Can't you, isn't it possible in almost any country to bring out a lot of people in one place at one time?
No question about it, whatever. They can keep them away or they can bring them out. But Sadat made a very interesting comment in that respect. After we arrived at the guest house, he said, you know, you can always get people out, but you can't make them smile. And he said those people were smiling. I noted, for example, as we were riding along, he tried to say something to me over the din of the crowd, and he kept pointing to his heart. And I was a little worried then because I had heard that he'd had a couple of small heart attacks, and I wondered if he was suffering pain. And then I finally heard what he said. He said, "This is from the heart. They trust you. They love you. They are so happy you are here."
Some of the signs over the road said, "We trust Nixon," and the American press particularly said that a lot of the trip was planned because of the intended domestic impact because of Watergate. How did you read the signs, "We trust Nixon"?
Well, the signs had nothing to do with Watergate. They had to do with what the Egyptians felt about me and the policies that I had instituted after the war in 1973. They felt that after a long period, 6 years of no communication between the United States and Egypt, or no relations, I should say, that we were again friends. They knew that I was pro-Israeli because we had saved Israel in 1973 with the airlift. But they knew that I was not anti-Egyptian. On the contrary, that I thought it was possible and also necessary to be friends with the Israelis and also friends with the Egyptians and the Arabs. And they meant that they trusted me as one who would be fair, something that they had not had, they thought, in a U.S. administration for some time.
One of the events during this summit was a long train ride to Alexandria, where for several hours you and he stood in an open car waving at people, which I think drove both security forces a little crazy.
Well, as a matter of fact, it was a 3-hour train ride.
I've got to pick up that question. Frank, I think your clipboard must have hit your microphone or something and waved the question down. Let's just do a pickup on Frank. One, give me a tight shot on Frank. 3 seconds, Frank, and you can do your question over. 3.
One of the parts of that trip was a long, several-hour train ride to Alexandria in an open train, which I think drove both security forces a little crazy.
Well, the train ride, of course, was one of the highlights. I should say that the estimates of crowds from the airport into the guest house at Cairo was over 1 million. That was by press that was not particularly interested in seeing a large crowd be coming out. They grew and grew all the way along the way as we went to the pyramids, went there and came back. And then I really think the top was the train ride and the welcome also in Alexandria, which followed it. That very day, over 3.5 million people, by conservative estimates, were there at the train stations, along the sidings and so forth, and of course in Alexandria itself. Actually, what we rode on was a flatbed car. They didn't have any kind of an open car as you have for a parade and an automobile. And so we stood there in the flatbed car, and we had to stand there because the people were along the side waving and shouting and so forth. It was a little difficult for me because I had had this phlebitis attack in Salzburg, and after standing for 3 hours, when I got to the guest house, I had to have somebody help pull my shoe off because my ankle was swollen so. But believe me, it was worth it. I didn't feel any pain while we were there noticing the crowds and, of course, responding to them.
It was...
There was a rather...
Let's start, you want to start that again without my interrupting?
Yeah. Incidentally, there was a rather eerie event there. As we were going along, there was a place where the highway ran parallel to the train track. And here was a hearse going along, keeping right up with the train. And I had a thought in the back of my mind, I wonder if some way it had leaked out, because I had warned Haig and the others. I said, don't tell anybody I've had this phlebitis attack. I wondered if it leaked out, and they had the hearse there thinking that something might happen to me. But then I checked with his Secret Service and ours, and they said what had happened was they had the hearse there because on that same track they had had a few assassinations about 2 weeks before. So it was a rather dicey trip, but it turned out all right.
Did you ever feel that you were in danger, that your life was being endangered by what you were doing on that trip? Even if you didn't feel pain, did you feel that by extending yourself the way you did, that the phlebitis might take you at any time?
No, not really. I've always been very stoical, very fatalistic about danger, whether it's the possibility of somebody shooting me or the possibility of having a heart attack or something of that sort. If it will happen, it will happen. The thing to do is to go on and do the best you can. People think it's a little stupid, and perhaps it is, but there's nothing you can do about it. So I would also say that those who constantly worry about somebody's going to attack me, or maybe I'm going to exert myself and have a physical condition, they only make it worse. When you worry, you bring it on. Don't worry. What will happen will happen.
There are people who think that you've made a pact with the devil and plan to outlive us all. A, is that true? B, do you think about death?
No, I don't think about death. As far as outliving people, I don't want to outlive everybody. I would like to outlive a few of my enemies, and I think that worries them a bit.
What was tea at Sadat's palace in Alexandria like?
Well, that tea was very interesting because it was such a contrast to what Sadat had shown me as we left Cairo. Cairo is a huge city, and it has some of the worst slums in the world. And as we drove through the slum areas, you know, railroad tracks there, as they do in this country, they go through the worst parts of town. As we drove through it, he said, I want you to see the worst as well as the best of our country. And then so when we got to Cairo, there at his palace there, out on the lawn in an afternoon, we had British high tea. Believe me, it was more British than the British. The liveried servants, the quiet, very civilized conversation, low tones, everything was done just right. But I thought, an ominous thought at that point, I thought that of the tremendous contrast between the wealth that was there, displayed there, and the slums that I had seen. And I also felt at that time that it was very important that in our programs toward Egypt, I felt it then, I feel it even more today, that rather than concentrating so much on military assistance, there should be more economic assistance. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. They need assistance, and we should help them.
In reading what you wrote about that, something appealed greatly to me. You said it was that at that tea was served the most exquisite and extensive collection of pastries that you'd ever seen.
When we think of tea in this country, unless we've been to Britain, we think of a tea bag, which makes the most horrible brew, incidentally. It isn't done with class or style or what have you. But in Britain, tea is really an extra meal. And you have all sorts of cakes and cookies and pastries and so forth, and set out so well. It's really very, very high living. And I must say, I have seen it in Karachi, where they are more British than the British. I've seen it in Sydney, Australia, and also in Auckland, New Zealand, where they're more British than the British. But believe me, nothing to equal what I saw in Cairo. Incidentally, I think I should say that the welcome in Egypt, I think, was due to three things. First, what we have already touched upon, the fact that they felt that I was fair, that they could trust me to be fair. And second, they thought I was a friend. They want to be friends with Americans. They didn't like the Russians. They wanted to be friends with Americans. Third, because they wanted peace. And as Sadat said to me, he said, they are aware, our people are, that you have worked for peace, not only with us and in this area, but with the Soviet Union, with China, and so forth. But there was another factor. I don't think there's any question but those millions we saw, over 6.5 million in those 3 days in Egypt, realized the United States was a rich country. And they thought that possibly the good relations with the U.S. would bring a better economic life for themselves. They probably thought I was carrying a good bag of money.
10 or a dozen years from now, when one of your grandchildren, Alexander or Christopher or Jenny, is old enough and asks you, Granddad, what was Watergate? How will you answer?
Well, it will depend first on what they've learned in school, whether I will have to disabuse them of what they may have learned there or start afresh. If I were to start afresh, it would be, I think, somewhat along this line. Watergate was a botched up attempt to break in and to bug the Democratic National Committee. When I say it was botched up, I am referring to several things. One, I could never understand why anybody would want to bug the National Committee. I know national committees. There's nothing in the Republican National Committee worth knowing. You go to the Campaign Committee, and I'm sure the same is true of the Democratic National Committee. The second was the way that it's done. I remember reading about it when the report first came out, when I was in Miami. And I saw the Miami Herald, and I read about 6 men wearing surgical rubber gloves who had been caught trying to bug the Democratic National Committee. And I instantly thought, 6 men doing the job that one professional could do? I also was mystified by the fact that it was later indicated that the CIA had advanced knowledge of the break-in. They never told me. The Democratic Committee had advanced knowledge of the fact that a break-in was to occur. And Jack Anderson, the columnist, had advanced knowledge. As a matter of fact, it was so clumsily done that I would have to say that a pretty good case could be made, as some have made it, that it was deliberately botched up, that they wanted to get caught. So much for that. And so I would also say Watergate was illegal, and that it was wrong, and that it was very, very stupid thing to do. But whatever the stupidity of Watergate, the original break-in, or attempt to break in, I should say, which failed, that was exceeded by our reaction to it. It was stupidity at its very highest. Looking back, I don't understand why it happened that way. I think I do understand, but the reasons were apparently that the people on our White House staff and in the committee, with perhaps the best of intentions, felt that it was very important not to allow this particular break-in to be escalated into a way that it would affect so-called higher-ups. And so consequently, they tried to contain it. Now, there was no reason to be concerned about it affecting a higher-up. After all, that wasn't going to affect the election. We were leading McGovern, who was going to be the Democratic candidate, by a margin of 2-1 when that occurred. We were going to win going away anyway, because I had just come back from the great triumph of the Moscow summit. And of course, we were making progress in ending the war in Vietnam. But nevertheless, they felt that. And so as a result, they tried to come up with various schemes to contain it, to keep it from touching people higher up. And we didn't concentrate on doing what we should have done to clean it up right then when we could have. After the election, of course, there was even less excuse for not doing something about it. My notes and diaries made when we were at Camp David, when I was trying to bring the war to Vietnam to an end, to reorganize the government, prepare the inaugural speech, to select new members of the cabinet. My notes indicated that over and over again I said, let's get a report on this thing, let's clean it up, because the election is over now. But nothing was done. And then we simply compounded those failures. We even considered giving clemency to those that had done it so that they wouldn't talk about those higher up. We didn't do it, but we considered it. We talked about it. And we even considered, as the infamous or notorious tape of March 21st, 1973 indicated, considered paying blackmail. We didn't do it. We decided not to, as that tape also disclosed, but nevertheless we talked about it. And the problem was that all of that was, of course, exacerbated by the fact that what we talked about, even though we didn't do it, was on tape. And so what happened was that the way we handled it, and we're responsible for it, the way we handled it, took what was basically a misdemeanor, a break-in in which nobody was hurt, and made it the crime of the century. I must say, with the assist of the media and the assist of our very, may I say, intelligent and ruthless Democratic opponents.
Do you think people should have been shocked or surprised or appalled, as people were, that in the Oval Office or in the office of the President, whichever of your offices it was, that you even considered paying blackmail?
Oh yes, I think they would be surprised. They would not be surprised if they had studied politics generally. That they wouldn't have been surprised that there would be a discussion of that, because let's face it, many administrations have had problems, and instead of allowing those problems become politically negative, they try to avoid it. I mean, Lyndon Johnson's handling of the Bobby Baker case, for example, was certainly no attempt to bring all the facts out into the open. I think another point that should be made about...
Excuse me. 1 second, I need to make a quick stop here, right?
I'm going to stop.
Now, keep
You
taking
can
a moment,
look at
please.
the watch now. Huh?
Yes, now you
Sorry, I'm not ready. Okay.
I'll just bring it off. Here? What is it? Well, it must be from that sneezing.
It could possibly be.
Yeah.
You might have a little bit of a hay
I
fever.
got a little of that hatred. Oh, it doesn't make any difference. They'll think we're putting the tears on.
Yeah. Where is it when we need it? This is too soon.
I had a little sneezing spell when you put the powder on the day. I'll just start out when we finish here.
We're going to pick up with the president.
Yes.
Okay, we'll come up on
Or no, I was asking.
Forward, I'll pull your coat down. Coat. Now lean back.
Okay, stand by, everybody. 10 seconds out. We'll pick up on the president. Ray, while you're there, the president of the right temple up here, on his right side, see it?
Lower down,
No, down lower.
right in the sideburn, yeah.
Okay, that's it.
I wonder if we really should try to have everything so perfect like this. I think it's sort of silly.
Okay, let's go.
They ready?
Or not yet. You gonna start?
You ready? Yeah.
Okay, take 2 seconds, Mr. President, then start.
1, 2. When anyone would ask me what was Watergate, I think we should indicate too what it was not. No one was killed at Watergate. No one profited from Watergate, our scandal, as compared with the Teapot Dome scandal and the Bobby Baker scandal and the Truman 5%er IRS scandals and the Abscam scandals. No election was affected or stolen by it, as some believe the election of 1960 was stolen. As a matter of fact, Watergate cost us votes. It didn't gain us any. I would say that what happened here was that because of the way we handled it, however, it allowed our opponents in the media and our opponents among the more partisan Democrats to exploit the issue and to indicate to the public at large that the whole administration was shot through with corruption, that we were repressive, that we were frightening people, that we were bugging people by the hundreds, by the thousands, that we were engaging in, quote, dirty tricks at every opportunity. And so much of that, of course, was untrue.
When you say no one was killed at Watergate, what do you mean by that?
I mean by that very simply, that when you think of any kind of an incident of this sort, a so-called high crime, you think of somebody losing his life or somebody losing a great deal of money or something of that sort. This was not in that category. It was a political shenanigan, wrong, illegal, and very stupidly handled, true.
Are you aware of the bumper strips referring to Chappaquiddick, no one died at Watergate?
No, as a
Or
matter
no one
of,
drowned at Watergate?
I've seen those bumper strippers. No one, those bumper strips. No one drowned at Watergate. And I guess the implication there is to point out this is in contrast to the Teddy Kennedy situation as far as Chappaquiddick was concerned, and what some think was a cover-up.
How do you think it was a cover-up?
I would say that I don't know what the facts are, and that would make a prima facie case that it could have been.
You're aware that the judge in the case said that Senator Kennedy couldn't have been telling the truth?
Yes. No reason to judge him at this point. I mean, he's paid more of a price than anybody will guess, and as far as I'm concerned, that's all in the past.
How extensive, you say that the dirty tricks were not done at every opportunity. How extensive on a 10-point dirty trick scale, looking at politics over the last 30 years, do you think that the Nixon campaign 1972 dirty tricks were?
I'd say about one or two. I recall, for example, I've been the victim of dirty tricks, including bugging in 1962. There was no question about that. There's a very famous character, a real professional, delightful fellow, as a matter of fact, named Dick Tuck. And he used to sabotage our campaign schedules and send people the wrong way and disrupt our meetings and so forth. He did it in 1962 in that campaign. He did it again in, of course, he had done it also. He did it in 1960 in the presidential campaign, and then he did it in spades in 1962 when I was running against Pat Brown. But the media, being, shall we say, not particularly in my corner, just called that fun and games. And then when Segretti, our so-called dirty tricks man, whom I frankly had never had the opportunity of even meeting, when he tried to practice some of these things on our Democratic opponents, they became high crimes and misdemeanors. It's just a double standard. This sort of thing happens in campaigns. I don't particularly like it, particularly when it happens to me, and I don't like to see that be interjected in what should be particularly a high-level presidential campaign. But it's going to happen because people are human.
You say you were bugged in 1962. Who bugged you?
Oh, the opposition.
Do you think that Lyndon Johnson bugged your campaign in 1968?
We had reports to that effect, as a matter of fact, directly from J. Edgar Hoover, so I would assume that that was the case.
How, looking back now, how do you tell yourself that somebody as wary, as canny, as experienced as you got dragged into the Watergate cover-up the way that you did?
But there's no excuse for anybody, as you say, and I can't make the self-serving statement that I am so canny and experienced and all that sort of thing, although I have lived quite a bit. There's no excuse for what happened, but there could be a reason. I just made a basic mistake at the beginning of that year, that campaign year. You know, I've always been criticized throughout my political career for running my own campaigns. I ran my own campaign in '46. I did it in '50 when I was elected to the Senate. I did it in '52 and '56. So I had campaign assistants, but everybody knew that I was watching every jot and tittle of everything all the way along the line. '68 also. I was constantly, our campaign people thought, interfering with how it was going, but I was watching everything. Came 1972. And here I was going to China in 1972. We were negotiating an arms control agreement with Russia. We were trying to end the war in Vietnam and so forth. And I decided, well, this is one time I'm not going to get involved in the campaign. I'm going to delegate it all. That was a mistake. I should have watched it. If I had been watching it, believe me, we wouldn't have ever bugged that. But if we had done it, it would have been more successful. But we would never have done it. And we have never handled it that way afterwards because, as I say, that compounded it. It was not the initial break-in that caused the problem. It was the failure to move on it as we should. And I would say that had I been running it and I was responsible, then I would have known where to turn. But since I wasn't running it, I then had the problem of feeling, and I think in retrospect I'd probably do it again, that I should stand by my friends. I don't know who was responsible, but I was bound to stand by them and try to avoid it moving higher up.
There has never been any evidence that you knew about the plans for the break-in advance. In fact, there's significant evidence that you didn't know. Why do you think, though, that from the very earliest, the first polls taken after the break-in, public opinion polls, I think something in the first one, something like 46% of the people felt that you had known about it in advance and that it was just normal kinds of politics?
I think for the very reason that I've indicated. It was pretty generally known among the people that I ran a tight ship. It was pretty generally known because criticism had been made of the fact that I constantly ran my own campaigns, that I was in control. Bob Haldeman wrote, as a matter of fact, that anybody who watched the Nixon administration would figure nothing like that's going to happen without his knowing about it, although he does not say that I knew about it. Of course I didn't.
Given the way that you've described the development of the events, the kind of information you were getting in the kind of time frame that you were getting it, would you do the same things again? Would you make the same decisions again?
No, in retrospect, what I would have done at the beginning was to sit down, I think, with all of our campaign people and say, now look here, we're going to win this election. If we're going to have to take some heat about this thing, let's take it. Now I want to get all the facts and get it out, rather than continuing to do what I did do. You see, the problem was that in that period, that we're talking in the period around June 20th of the balance of the year, I wasn't thinking that much about Watergate. Oh, there's a lot of on the tapes, but only an infinitesimal percentage of what is on tape is about that. My main concern was ending that war. We were negotiating, we were sending messages to continue our various initiatives to keep them alive and healthy with China, with Russia, and the rest. And frankly, I just didn't concentrate. That was the mistake. I should have remembered, however, something that Winston Churchill wrote. I read quite a bit and read quite a bit before I ever became president. And he said something that every leader in the future should have in mind. He said it has been his observation that the great leaders do the big things well, but they tend to stumble on the little things. You can't do all the little things, but believe me, in this case, a little thing became a big thing and, of course, destroyed us.
One of the theories postulated is that one of the reasons that you didn't sit down with all the campaign people and say, what happened and let's get this out, is that you were afraid to ask that very question because you were afraid that it would lead, that the answer would involve or implicate people who were your friends and longtime associates.
I'd have to say that was true. I think that subconsciously I didn't want to know. If, for example, one of my top people, longtime associates, because he didn't have control of the situation, had made a stupid mistake. I didn't want them to become involved. Very tough thing. I remember, for example, speaking of books and so forth, another quotation that is of considerable interest. It was one that about Gladstone, who of course was a great liberal prime minister of Britain in the 19th century. And he made the comment to the effect that the first requisite of a good prime minister is to be a good butcher. I wasn't, frankly, a good enough butcher, I must say. I recall very well when Henry Peterson, who took over the investigation of the Watergate issue after the second term began. He came in to see me, and he laid before me some accusations that had been made against Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And I said, on the other hand, I said, however, those aren't proved. I said, I can't fire somebody simply because of the appearance of guilt. And he responded, he said, Mr. President, that speaks very well of you as a man. It does not speak well of you as a president. And so I would say, perhaps, and I'm not referring to Haldeman and Ehrlichman, but anybody else in a campaign organization, that's a decision that every president at times has to confront. Is he going to be human and compassionate, or is he going to be ruthless and cold? I must say, looking back, I've got to admire Harry Truman in a way for the way he stood by his people, even though they were political liabilities. It's a close call.
Some of your critics think that it was very ignoble of you when you wrote in your memoirs that Watergate wouldn't have happened without Martha Mitchell. What did you mean by that?
John Mitchell is one of the ablest men in politics that I've ever known, and a very able lawyer, a very careful man. He's also a very honorable man. I can never imagine that John Mitchell would ever have approved the Watergate break-in, and assuming he didn't approve it, would have allowed it to slip by through the cracks if he had been concentrating on the campaign. And whether that was ignoble or not, there was no question that Martha Mitchell had a problem, a very deep problem. Some thought it was just alcohol and drugs and so forth, but it was even more than that. She was emotionally unstable, and it just drove John Mitchell crazy. He couldn't concentrate on it at all, and that's why he resigned from the campaign committee shortly after Watergate broke.
Do you think that the media exploited her instability?
Shockingly. I've never forgiven them for it.
Why did you bug yourself?
The amusing thing about that is that had the tape system that we had been exposed apart from Watergate, nobody would have given it a second thought. I remember the headlines, Nixon bugged himself. Well, as a matter of fact, what really, I must say, at first amused me and then it angered me was to see the hypocritical, sanctimonious statements by people representing the Kennedy camp and the Johnson camp saying, oh, they had never had a taping system. They were horrified that there could have ever been a taping system in the White House. Now, come on, who are they kidding? Franklin Roosevelt, it's now revealed, he did taping. Even Eisenhower did on selective cases. There are 200 reels of tapes in the Kennedy Library. There are thousands of hours of tapes in the Johnson Library. Taping was done, ostensibly, in my case it was done, for the purpose of having it for the historical record. And under the circumstances then, when we said, did we bug ourselves, it was for the historical record and not for any other purpose. I must say that in Johnson's case, when I came into the White House on that first day in January the 20th, I saw this taping equipment around. It hadn't been removed that he had put in. He had it not only in the Oval Office and also in the Cabinet Room, but also in the reception room where people who were to come in to see him were sitting, so that he could hear what they said about him before they came in to see him. Of course, we didn't install any in any places like that. We had it only in the Oval Office, in the Cabinet Room, and in the EOB, which were all recognized to be formal places. But I would say that the place that I was most surprised to find it, when I looked under the bed, just happened to looking for my shoes a couple of mornings later, and I found all the taping equipment right under the bed. He even had the bedroom taped. Incidentally, just so there won't be any improper connotation about that, Johnson often saw people in his bedroom. I saw him there. The only time I went to the White House from the time I was vice president until I became president, I had a cup of coffee with him there after a gridiron dinner.
In your memoirs, you tell a story about Bobby Kennedy going in to see Johnson.
Johnson had a practice of using his taping system in a very deliberate way. Let me explain the difference between his taping system and the one Kennedy had and the one the Eisenhower had and ours. In their cases, it was manually operated. In other words, when they had somebody coming in that they wanted to make a record of, they turned the tape on. They didn't tell people, but they turned it on so that they'd have the record. In our case, it was voice activated. Everything was taped, which of course was probably stupid, and yet perhaps a bit more honorable, because if you weren't going to tell the individual that he was being taped, far better for it to be done on a general basis rather than on a selective basis. Well, on this day, Bobby Kennedy was scheduled to come in to see Johnson. This is the day that Johnson was going to get his revenge. Johnson didn't particularly like Jack Kennedy. He hated Bobby Kennedy. J. Edgar Hoover has told me that chapter and verse. And so here was his opportunity after Bobby Kennedy had been so rough on him. While Kennedy was president, Jack Kennedy was president, he was going to get back at him. He was going to have the pleasure of telling Bobby Kennedy that he, Johnson, was not going to support Bobby Kennedy for president. After the meeting was concluded, and apparently it was a pretty hairy confrontation, and Johnson called in the fellow that was running the taping system and says, "I want you to transcribe the tape." The fellow came back ashen-faced. He couldn't do it. It had been scrambled. And what had happened, apparently, they thought, was that Bobby Kennedy, who knew Johnson and also knew himself, had carried a little scrambling device in with him, and he put it on so that it scrambled the conversation.
Why didn't you...
Too bad we didn't have a scrambler for some of ours.
Why didn't you burn them?
I must have had several thousand letters on that since leaving office. Was stupid, should have been burned, because at that particular point, once they were exposed, then they could not be used for historical purposes. They were going to use for purposes that I did not think were appropriate. There were several reasons they weren't burned. First, when the taping system was disclosed, it was the wrong time. I was in the hospital with pneumonia, and I just couldn't make a tough decision like that. Second, I had bad advice from well-intentioned lawyers who had the sort of the cockeyed notion that I would be destroying evidence. But these tapes at that point hadn't been subpoenaed by anybody, and the best evidence were the individuals themselves who were there. But on the other hand, I listened to them. I think there was a third reason, however. I think that I felt that the tapes were probably an insurance against people who had participated in meetings and who, in the light of the Watergate thing, might go out and lie about what had been said. I had listened to the tapes involving John Dean on June the 4th, and I felt that they were an insurance against that kind of shall we say, misrepresentation.
So looking back and balancing all this, if you knew then what you know now, can you say that, that you would have destroyed them?
Oh yes, I should have destroyed them.
Still would have done.
They should have been destroyed, and they should have been destroyed for another reason. If I had thought, let's face it, if I had thought that they revealed criminal activities, I would have been out of my mind not to destroy them. So I would have destroyed them not because I thought there were criminal activities on them, but because it was an invasion of the very purpose of the tapes, which were for historical purposes and not to hold people that had come into the president's office and talked freely to those words that they had spoken so many years before. That's just not right.
You're the man who criticized Harry Truman for using phrases like "give him hell" or using the word "damn," said that he was a bad example to the youth of America. How do you reconcile that kind of position with the language, your language, that appeared on the White House tape, all the expletives deleted?
Well, one thing that I would have preferred is to not have had that term expletives deleted. That leaves an implication that probably they were worse than they were. They were bad enough as it was. And eventually, of course, everybody will know what it was if they don't already know. The point that I should make is that as far as profanity is concerned, I must admit, a bit old-fashioned. I never swear in public in all of my public life, and I never swear in front of women. As a matter of fact, let me make an exception. On occasion, just in the family sometimes, I'll damn this or something of that sort, and Mrs. Nixon really shapes me up right away. She says, that's a bad example for the girls, and she's right. On the other hand, we all know, or I would say any sophisticated person knows, that profanity for many people is a way of blowing off steam. It doesn't make it right, but on the other hand, it's done. And I would say that while the tapes show our profanity, that isn't the first time a few expletives haven't been hurled around the Oval Office. I was there when President Eisenhower was ranting a bit, as he had occasion to do. His face would flush about those mossback Republicans, those damn mossback Republicans, and how they were holding back some of the programs that we wanted. And I met with Jack Kennedy right after the Bay of Pigs disaster. And I mean, he knew all the four-letter words, and I didn't blame him one bit. I was really appreciated the fact that he felt that I was a good enough friend, that he could let his hair down. And I'm not going to indicate what he said. And of course, Lyndon Johnson's earthy language, shall I say, was legendary. Mine was different. It was on tape and different from Johnson and Kennedy because as far as their tapes are concerned, they're safe in their libraries and the expletives will be deleted. In my case, they will not be.
So you will be known warts and all.
That's right. And I'm embarrassed by it because it gives an indication that I think of basically hypocrisy. But on the other hand, I think that a public man does have a responsibility to set an example. I don't think he should swear in public. I don't believe that men should swear in mixed company. That's old-fashioned, I agree. But on the other hand, I must say we're not going to be able to outlaw profanity in private among men, particularly when they served in the armed services and particularly when they served with the Navy and Marine Corps, as I did. I heard all the words.
Do you think there was or could have been a CIA conspiracy to remove you from office?
I don't know. I know many people think so. I would say that I've found it difficult to understand why the CIA, which apparently had advanced knowledge of the break-in, didn't inform me. I've found it difficult to understand how it could have been that at least two of those involved had CIA connections, and nevertheless that it was not brought to my attention as far as the break-in occurring. I must say, too, the CIA had motive. It was no secret that I was dissatisfied with the CIA, with its reports and particularly with their appraisals of Soviet strength and our other problems around the world.
You think they feared you?
No question about it, and they had reason to. I was going to shape up that organization and the Defense Department, the whole government for that matter, but particularly that one. At one occasion I said I thought we could cut a third of the people out of the CIA and do a better job. I didn't want to weaken it, as unfortunately it was castrated in the post-Watergate era. I wanted to strengthen it. I wanted to get rid of some of the dead wood and so forth, and they knew it, so they had a motive. I'm not prepared to say whether there was a conspiracy or not. I would only say that it should make a fascinating study for an investigative reporter. He won't win any prizes by writing anything that would not be anti-Nixon. But on the other hand, it would perhaps be historically interesting.
If there was such a conspiracy, do you think that reporter would ever live to write about it? Is it the kind of thing that will ever come out?
I have a feeling that all of this talk that the CIA is going to knock off those that will, shall we say, reveal some of their covert operations, those in this country, I think that's exaggerated. I think that may have been the case in times past, not now.
Do you think that you had control of the CIA when you were president? That it was responsive to you, and that you knew what it was doing, and that it wasn't doing anything you didn't want it to do?
I think the CIA under Dick Helms tried to reflect what the president wanted. I know, for example, that there were no plots to assassinate a foreign leader while I was president. They knew that I would never have approved such a thing. my concern about the CIA was basically its competence. I just thought that they had a lot of dead wood, a lot of the Georgetown types and so forth that were holdovers from previous administrations, and I wanted to clean them out and strengthen it. And I'm sorry I didn't get that chance.
In your memoirs, you refer to a conversation with John Connolly early in 1974 when he told you that the Arizona, what he called the Arizona Mafia, was out to get you. What do you think he meant by that?
I think what he meant was that in addition to the understandable opposition of the Democrats, the partisan Democrats, not all, but the partisan Democrats, that I had better worry about my right flank as well. What he meant was that there were several Republicans who wanted me out of office and Ford in. Let me say, I know Ford was not one of those. I know that because I know the man. He's an honorable man. He would never countenance it. However, I would well understand that some, not in a conspiratorial way, but that some might have felt that I was a liability, which probably I was at that point politically, that I was a liability and that they'd be better off with Ford in and me out. And so consequently, it is possible that Connolly's report was correct, but I am not prepared to say I just don't know.
Why do you think it was called the Arizona Mafia?
I don't know, possibly because the group was probably conservative oriented, which would be surprisingly. You would think usually it would be the liberals that would want me out.
You don't think it referred to Senator Goldwater or to Congressman Rhodes?
I would doubt that. I just don't know. As far as Goldwater was concerned, he of course denied that he had any part of that sort of thing.
Do you have any sense that there was, from the, say, the beginning of 1974 or earlier, a concerted effort to, if not to railroad you, or if not to at least grease the skids? Henry Kissinger has written that one of the ironies of your selection of Ford, who wasn't your first choice, was that while you thought because of his good relations with Congress he'd be able to make your case there, the opposite was the case. He was so acceptable to them and so unthreatening to them that by choosing him, you almost made it inevitable that you would be replaced.
I think Kissinger makes a very shrewd point. Usually he's the first to admit he is not a political expert, but in this case it is a shrewd observation. They felt certainly that they would be better off with Ford than with me, and that had perhaps something to do with it.
Do you think there was plotting going on during, formal or informal, during the year?
I think plotting is too strong a word because everybody's going to interpret that in the most sinister way. I think what happened is it was simply a coalescence of forces. There were some Republicans that wanted me out because they thought I was a political liability. They could get along better with Ford than with me. There were some Democrats, partisan Democrats, that wanted me out because they wanted to reverse the situation, the result of the elections of 1972, in which they had suffered such a shattering defeat. And I think under the circumstances, they all kind of ended up not working together in one huge sinister plot, but each in parallel ways coming together, and in the end, of course, bringing about the inevitable result.
You were under such tremendous, enormous emotional, physical, mental pressures during Watergate. A lot of people thought it would kill you and would have killed a lot of people. Why do you think it didn't? Why and how do you think you survived?
Well, curiously enough, I've had a lot of practice. I've gone through some pretty tough crises. The Hiss case, when I fought the whole Washington establishment and the media, the fund, when everybody thought that I could not survive on the ticket, 1956, the attempt to dump me off of the ticket, 2 shattering defeats, one for the presidency, and then one in 1962 for governor of California. Having been through all of that, that toughens your hide a bit. And as far as being able to survive this, I felt I was on the right side. I was sustained by what I thought was the right cause. And I must say, too, that I drew great strength from my family. The way they stood by me was really something very inspiring, very heartwarming.
Was this pressure different in quality or quantity from these earlier pressures?
Different certainly in quantity, because whatever the earlier pressures were, they finally ended. This was so intense for so long, and this, of course, reached enormous public attention. For example, Watergate, for months on end, led the three network programs. Not one, not two, but all three, day after day after day. There were headlines in papers across the country, day after day after day. That takes its toll. But I stood up under it rather well. I'm rather surprised that I'm still here.
You've described all the things that, or some of the things that Watergate wasn't, and described your a number of the elements of your role in it. What do you think you were guilty of?
Well, I was guilty of not malfeasance. Malfeasance means an intent to do something wrong, but misfeasance, failure to take a situation like this and to deal with it effectively. Let us understand, though, what Watergate is not, because I think it's very important for us to realize that once the Watergate thing broke, then those in the media who had a vested interest in my being driven from office and our partisans on the other side immediately expanded that to indicate that corruption infected the whole administration. For example, it was a repressive administration, and they made a great deal out of the fact that there were wiretaps. Now let's look at the wiretaps, very objectively and very fairly. A lot of myths about it. One, that they were illegal. They were not illegal. Wiretapping without warrants was legal for every president up till 1972, and we discontinued them when the Supreme Court said warrants would be required thereafter, even though the president had ordered it for national security purposes. And every president since World War II had used wiretaps. Second myth, we were wiretapping our political opponents. We were wiretapping across the country, radical groups and so forth and so on. A myth. Believe it or not, there were only a total of 19 wiretaps. 5 newsmen who printed stories which had top secret material in it, and 14 government officials who had had access to that same kind of material, or whom we thought had access. That was all there were. The purpose of the wiretaps was to avoid leaks of that sort in the future, to find out who was leaking. And incidentally, that purpose was legitimate. I should point out that that wasn't always the case. For example, during the Kennedy-Johnson administrations, Martin Luther King was wiretapped. Why? Because, as J. Edgar Hoover once said, he was wiretapped apparently at the Willard Hotel because a sex orgy might have been going on there. They wanted, apparently, for reasons that I'm not aware of and I can't understand, to find a way to embarrass him. And speaking of newsmen, people think that that's the first time newsmen were wiretapped. I should remind them that there's a record on file of a reporter being wiretapped during the Kennedy administration because it was learned that he was going to write a book on Marilyn Monroe that might have derogatory comments in them about the Kennedys. Now understand, I'm not saying this in condemnation of anything that others did. Maybe they had reasons that I'm not aware of. I am simply saying, 1, what we did was not illegal. 2, it was justified because it was very important to stop the leaks so that we could continue negotiations that led to the opening to China, that led to the settlements with the Soviet Union and the ending of the war in Vietnam. And finally, I would say that as far as the wiretaps are concerned, the idea that this was a repressive administration, it simply doesn't add up. Now, of course, some ask, what about the plumbers? Who were the plumbers? Is this a big conspiracy of people floating out across the country, intimidating people and the rest? 4 people for less than a year trying to plug leaks. It was a sort of a Keystone Cop operation. Plumbers is a pretty good name for it, and very ineffective as it turned out, as were the wiretaps.
Didn't the June 23rd tape show that your involvement in Watergate went beyond sort of this sort of a passive malfeasance? Because on that tape you ordered Bob Haldeman to go to the CIA and tell them to tell the FBI to keep out of the Watergate investigation. Didn't that go over the edge and actually involve you?
Well, let us understand how the June 23rd tape came about, how that conversation. It had been a long conversation about scheduling, about another trip that I was going to have to take and so forth. And at the very end, Bob Haldeman said that he had had a meeting with John Dean, that John Dean had come up with a scenario that might contain the Watergate investigation. He felt that it was important to contain it because it was getting into areas that might be embarrassing to us. He then went on to say that the FBI that was conducting the investigation thought that the CIA was involved, as of course former CIA, at least agents and operatives were involved. And that if the CIA could let the FBI know that they did not want the FBI to continue an investigation that might expose some of their other activities, that then the FBI would draw back. I made a very stupid mistake. I said, fine, go ahead and do it. We've done some things for Helms. There's no reason that he shouldn't do something for us on this. But let us understand, as far as my motive was concerned, you just don't look at it in terms of words said at a time. You look at it in terms of what you did and what you did later, just 2 weeks later, after this conversation. The director of the CIA, Pat Gray, called me on the phone. He said that he thought that some people in the White House staff, I think he said, were wounding me by their conduct. And then he went on to say that he was concerned about this contact in the CIA. I said, have you talked to them? He said, yes. He said, they say they have no interest in suppressing or limiting the investigation. I said, fine, go right ahead with your investigation. I didn't stop there. I called in Haldeman Ehrlichman. I said, we cannot have a cover-up. I said, I want to stop this. Be sure that the word gets out to everybody to continue. What I am saying here, yes, we considered the possibility, and I had hoped, for example, that the CIA would find that they didn't want the investigation to go forward. But when I was informed that they were not concerned about us going forward, I didn't hesitate one bit.
Isn't it true, though, that you, the information as it was presented to you and on which you made your decision was that it was a political reason, that Dean was afraid that the money would be traced to the committee, and that's why you approved calling in the CIA in the first place, whatever the other CIA involvements may or may not have been?
It was primarily political, as it turned out. My recollection at a later point was of the conversation with Pat Gray, in which I said, go ahead with the investigation, and consequently, that's why I left the impression, which was incorrect, but what I remembered at the time, that it was not political. It was primarily political there, but on the other hand, I would never have approved it unless there had been indications that the CIA might be interested. So there was a subsidiary reason as loan. I didn't in effect say, look, get the CIA to get into this thing whether they're interested or not. I said if they are concerned, then of course the FBI should not go forward.
Even given that it was months later and a lot had intervened and that the Gray phone call did direct the conduct, how could you forget such a central thing, that the initial cause was political?
It's difficult to understand, but, and again, no excuse, it perhaps will explain it. I had a lot of things on my mind. I remembered it as well as I could, and as a matter of fact, before I went public on that particular thing, I called Bob Haldeman on the phone, and I said, look, what do you remember about it? And he remembered it exactly as I did. Neither of us, of course, had refreshed our memories by listening to the tape.
Do you think that the country would be better off if the cover-up had succeeded and Watergate had never surfaced, or at least had never gone as far as it did, led to your resignation?
Ray Price, one of my biographers and my longtime speechwriter, and a very honorable man who would feel that any kind of a cover-up is wrong, morally, etc., believes that that's the case. I am not able really to be the best judge of that. Certainly, I think that under the circumstances, from a personal standpoint, it would have been best that Watergate not be expanded to the point that it was. In other words, to have a misdemeanor become the crime of the century didn't make any sense. And to have people today talk about not the crime of Watergate, but the crimes of Watergate, simply didn't make sense. It was that, of course, that brought us down.
People do think about, for example, in the crimes of Watergate, about your taxes, that you paid little or no taxes during the years that you were president and were probably a paper millionaire.
Well, let's just look at my presidency. Except for Harry Truman, I think I am the only president in this century who left the White House with his net worth less than when he came in. Now, that would tend to knock down the thing that I had profited from my service in the White House. There was a story, for example, that the $17 million had been spent on my place in San Clemente and the one in Florida. I sold the place at the height of the market 5 years after I left office for $2.5 million. And as a matter of fact, what the GSA had put in there reduced the value. Let me give you an example. Out in California, gas heat is cheaper than electric heat. We had a gas heating system in it. The Secret Service thought that a gas heating system ran the risk of fire. They changed it to electric, and so it reduced the value. Enough of that. Coming back to the tax situation, that, of course, was a really low blow. A low blow because I was very scrupulous about my tax returns throughout my life. I majored in tax law when I was in law school. However, I, of course, didn't prepare my own tax returns. I left it to my staff people who were supposed to be expert in the field. They made a mistake that was understandable. What happened was that I gave $2 million worth of my vice presidential papers. They were appraised at that to the government. That was common. Johnson had advised that he had done it. He told me that. He suggested that I do it, and previous government officials have been doing it for years. It was a legitimate tax deduction. Then in January, and then in 1969, at the end of the year, I signed a bill. I signed it, in which the Congress revoked that right to tax exemption. Now, as a matter of fact, at the time I signed that bill, I didn't have any feeling at all, and I wasn't doing it with relationship to my own gift of papers, because I had made my gift in March of that year. It had been delivered. My papers had been brought down from New York, delivered to the government. So what happened? What happened is that our tax man felt that there had to be a deed of the papers. He wrote a deed out, he signed it himself in my behalf, and dated it at the time that they were delivered. Now, lawyers do that on occasion. In this case, it was made to appear that this was all a fraud in order to avoid the payment of the taxes. So I paid the $300,000 in taxes that I otherwise would have been able to take as a deduction, as Johnson and others had done previously. When I left office, interestingly enough, my tax attorneys begged me to reopen the case. They said they would take it on a contingency and they could get the decision reversed. But I had agreed at that time, when the matter came up, to accept whatever the Joint Committee on Taxation would agree to, what they would recommend. They had recommended that I pay the tax, and I did. It happens.
When people think about Watergate, they also think about how your administration used the Internal Revenue Service to harass people, and how you even had a written down enemies list of opponents to go after and hurt.
I don't think, incidentally, that the thought is that I had a written down enemies list. I think they said there was, I think it's been claimed that there was an enemies list within the bowels of the administration and so forth.
John Dean had
the John Dean had collected, whatever that might be. And I wouldn't be surprised. Every administration has its friends and its enemies. We always divide press, everybody else up in those categories. You reward your friends and punish your enemies if you can.
But do you use the IRS to do that?
And certainly not. As a matter of fact, what happened here was simply a natural reaction of anybody in that office. I got reports, complaints as a matter of fact, from friends of John Wayne and Billy Graham that they were being harassed by the Internal Revenue Service on their tax returns, and they thought they were being harassed. because they were my friends. Now, they didn't tell me that, but, you know, the word gets to me. When I learned this, I hit the ceiling. And so I said, get the word out down to the IRS that I want them to conduct field audits, and that's the term, the technical term they use, of those who are our opponents, if they're going to do our friends. And I suggested that one they ought to look into was Larry O'Brien, who had received very heavy fees from the Hughes organization. What happened was that the word went to the IRS. The IRS, as it turned out, is often the case, did nothing. They made a big hullabaloo about the fact that we had attempted to use the IRS for political purposes. And then months later, Don Alexander, the head of the IRS, put out a report saying that the IRS had not audited anybody for political purposes, not one. So what I am saying here, that what I suggested was simply a reaction to what I thought was IRS policy that was unfair. I wanted them to be even-handed on it. And I must say that I probably should have gone further if I wanted to be political in view of what had happened to me, because I knew from an IRS auditor in California that they got orders directly from Washington to audit my returns in 1961 when I was running for governor of California. It's the way it works.
If you had had more control, would you have used it? Would you have used the IRS in sort of a tit-for-tat way it had been done to you, and therefore, does that power go with the office?
Oh, I would have been tempted. No, I don't want to indicate that I was simply going to turn the other way when an opportunity might present itself like that. But what I am saying here is this. We are charged in this Watergate period with enriching ourselves. We did not. We're charged with abusing the IRS and abusing other people and using the IRS for that purpose. We talked about it and so forth, but it did not happen. As far as this administration is concerned, it isn't pure. But on the other hand, it was one that is being held to a different standard than previous administrations. I'm not suggesting that because it was done in the past that makes it right now. I don't take the line that one right, what is it?
Two wrongs make a right.
That two wrongs make a right. But I do say that two wrongs make two wrongs. I just want a single standard.
Do you mean to say that when you were in the Oval Office talking to John Kennedy, when he called you in to ask for your advice and your support at the time of the Bay of Pigs, that you knew he was pushing the audit of your income tax returns?
Oh, I didn't know that he was pushing it. I assumed that he wasn't. No, I was assuming that was done by some of the very good political operatives that he had in his organization. No, I'm not sure that. I doubt if he would do it. I doubt if he would do it. I think, however, he could play hardball. I don't think he would have minded a bit if an audit came up that was embarrassing to me. I know, for example, that one of the tapes, which incidentally have come out since it's finally been revealed that the Kennedy people did tape, was a telephone call that he made to Pat Brown after Pat Brown beat me for governor. He wasn't interested in my political success, and I don't blame him one bit. I wouldn't have been either. He considered me to be one that almost beat him. He didn't want me to come back again.
In China, you told Zhou Enlai that you always learned more from your defeats than you did from your victories. What did you learn from Watergate?
From Watergate, I think first, a leader, much as he is interested in, as a matter of fact, obsessed by big issues, must not overlook the little issues that may become big. Second, once you have a problem, far better to deal with it quickly rather than to procrastinate, because a problem, if not dealt with quickly, is going to expand and to become something not only different in size but different in kind, as was the case with Watergate. And third, I would say a leader in those cases where the whole White House itself, the presidency is involved, sometimes it's necessary for him to put his own survival, the survival of the institution, above his personal loyalties. It's a tough one. The last one would be the hardest for me, And I think it'd be very hard for President Reagan, for example. One of his fine qualities, he's loyal to his friends.
If, following the Gilbert and Sullivan line, the punishment had fit the crime, what do you think would have been the proper, unless you think resignation was, what do you think would have been the proper punishment for what you did or the way you became involved in Watergate?
Well, I don't know as it serves any purpose even to speculate on that. There were some who suggested that a proper way to handle it would have been a resolution of censure by both houses of the Congress. But on the other hand, that didn't happen.
I think we've reached the end of our It's up, I would say 10 minutes, it's up to you.
10 minutes fine.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a 10-minute here and we'll come back and do an
Yes.